Hello everyone and welcome to a new book video. Today I'm sharing some brilliant reads for spring with you. The daffodils are blooming here in Yorkshire and I'm so excited for the start of spring, and as you know I love to do some seasonal reading, so I thought I'd share some spring book recommendations with you today. First up is one of my favourite books to read in the springtime, I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith. This is a classic coming-of-age story. I read this with my Seasons of Story community last spring, and it just reminded me all over again how much I love this book. It begins in March, and most of the book actually takes place during March, April and May, and then the last section of the book goes from June to October. So it's such a good spring read because so much of the action takes place during the springtime in this book. It's got a famous opening line, "I write this sitting in the kitchen sink." It's a type of diary told by a young girl who's just moving into womanhood, and she's observing her eccentric family who live in a crumbling castle in England, and her older sister and her rather complicated love life. It's a very well written, very funny book, and there are some wonderful spring scenes in this book too. One of my very favourite passages in the book describes May Day in the British countryside. So definitely one to try if you've never read it, and if you love coming-of-age fiction and books written in the interwar years or set in the interwar years, definitely one to try. And then if you're in the mood for a light-hearted, funny springtime read, then I really recommend this one, Hens Dancing by Rafaela Barker. This is a bit of a more modern day Diary of a Provincial Lady type book. It's told in diary form. It starts off in March. Well, technically it actually starts in February, but that's a bit more like a prologue to the book, and it very rapidly moves to March, and then the book is divided into the seasons. So it goes through spring, summer, autumn and winter, which I really like. So the action essentially takes place over a year, and it describes a woman who is trying to cope living as a single mum. She's just divorced her no good husband, and it's very, very funny. If you like Diary of a Provincial Lady or Bridget Jones's Diary, then I would recommend giving this a try. It's set in the Norfolk countryside, which I love, and also there are some brilliant spring scenes in this book. There's a passage where the narrator and her children and her mother enjoy a picnic in a bluebell wood, for instance, but it's also just very funny, and yeah, definitely one that I recommend if you fancy more of a light-hearted with a bit of a romance to it too. If you fancy that kind of read, then this would be a lovely one to cuddle up with one sunshiny spring afternoon. And talking of funny books, you know how much I love P.G. Wodehouse. This is the first book in his Blandings Castle series, which I love only next to his Jeeves and Wooster books. And the first one in the series is called Something Fresh, and it takes place in the springtime. P.G. Wodehouse is just a master of humour, so definitely one to try if you maybe have read the Jeeves and Wooster books, but you haven't tried his Blandings Castle series yet, then I really recommend giving this one a go. And then a book that's new to me this spring, but I thought was very fitting for the season that sees Mother's Day take place. That's Stories for Mothers and Daughters, and it's a selection of short stories by writers like A.S. Byatt, Jeanette Winterson, and many more. And this was very kindly sent to me by the British Library Women Writers, and I've already dipped into it. I think the first story in here is by Richmal Crompton, and I love her writing, and I really enjoyed that short story. But I love this idea too of theming a collection of short stories around mothers and daughters. So this, in the lead up to Mother's Day, which in the UK takes place in March, is the perfect read for me right now, so I wanted to share this one as well. Just before I share the next book, I wanted to tell you about my offer code with Serious Readers. Serious Readers are very kindly sponsoring today's video. As you know, I'm a huge fan of their reading lights. I use my high definition floor light every day, and so I'm really pleased to have an offer code to share with you today. My offer code is Miranda, just Miranda, all capital letters. And if you use that offer code on any of the high definition lights by serious readers, you get £150 off any of those high definition lights, as well as free shipping within the UK. Reading is such a big part of my life. I read every day, and even though we're now going into spring and the days are lengthening and getting brighter, I still use my Serious light all the time whenever I'm reading. I live in quite an old house, which is very low lit. Most of the windows are north facing, so I really appreciate having an excellent reading light. The amazing light quality is something I really value about my Serious light. All of the high definition lights by serious readers feature something called daylight wavelength technology. And this essentially replicates the daylight spectrum as closely as technically possible. So when I'm reading with my Serious light, I feel like I'm reading in a pool of natural light, or as close to natural light as you can get. And this really helps me to avoid eye strain and just makes reading even more of a pleasure to me. I love that I can adjust the width of the beam of the light as well as the brightness levels when I'm reading, so I get just the right amount of light that's good for me. If you also would love a great reading light in your life, then do take advantage of my offer code. Again, that's Miranda, all capital letters, Miranda. And if you use that offer code, you get £150 off any of the high definition lights by serious readers, as well as free shipping within the UK. I'll put all of the details, including the relevant link and my offer code, in the video description box just down below, so do check down there to find all of the relevant information. But now let's get back to my video. Now, in the springtime, of course, I think about gardens and gardening season, so I also have a few books here that are great for those of you who like to read about gardens, especially in the spring. Of course, one of the most famous books is The Secret Garden. I read this with the Comfort Book Club, you may remember, last spring, and it was so fun returning to this book then. But it is such a joy. I really did love returning to it, and it's just such a classic about the magic of a garden coming back to life and the restorative power of the natural world too. So this will always be a classic for me. Another classic that I just adore is Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. Of course, I love her book, The Enchanted April, as a spring read too. I mean, that's such a brilliant one, and I like to listen to that one as an audiobook, actually, many springs. But I also really recommend Elizabeth and Her German Garden, which was about the author's own experience of wanting to grow a garden and some of the frustrations that come into that for her. But it's just very funny. It's so lyrically told. I love Elizabeth von Arnim's writing, and she writes about the joys and the beauty of nature and of gardens so well. So that's one of the reasons why I love this book. And then another book that's brilliant on gardens and gardening is My Garden Book by Jamaica Kincaid. This is about the author's garden in Vermont and her passion for gardening. She also writes about other gardeners that she admires. For instance, she references Gertrude Jekyll's books quite a lot in here, which I like because I love her writing on gardens and gardening as well. She writes about other famous gardens, like I really like her essay on Monet's garden, for instance. So there's just a whole lot of inspiration in this book about gardens, and that makes it a really wonderful read for the spring when our gardens are coming back to life. Now, another book that's also about growing a garden, that's a real favourite of mine, is An Episode of Sparrows by Rumer Godden. This is technically cast as a children's book, but I honestly don't really understand why. I think it's just because there are children who are main characters in this book, but the tone, the feel, the subject matter and themes to me are much more adult appropriate in many ways, although I think I would have enjoyed this book as a child. But to me, it really is an adult book in many ways, and it's a book that I think adults would love. But it's about a young girl who's been sort of abandoned by her mother. She's never really known her father, and she's growing up in London in an area that has very little beauty. But one day she sort of sees a plant growing and she decides that she's going to create her own garden. And she does this in the sort of bombed out remains of a Catholic church. And it's her own little secret garden. But how this garden affects other people in the community is very much at the heart of this story. And it really is just an extraordinarily written, wonderful book. So again, another book about gardens and the importance of being in contact with nature and of beauty in that way. It's another book that sort of follows those themes and one I really love. Then for a bit of light-hearted fun as well, I have to recommend The Lark by E. Nesbit. This is another book that I've read with my Comfort Book Club, and it's such a fun one. I've chosen this because, again, it's a bit linked to the gardening theme. This is about some young female cousins who discover that their guardian has absconded with their inheritance, essentially, leaving them pretty much penniless, although he has got them a little cottage in the countryside. And they move there and they start trying to sort of sell flowers and have like a cottage-based industry. The author is E. Nesbit, who's very famous for her children's books like The Railway Children and Five Children and It. This was an adult novel that she wrote, and I feel it deserves to be much more widely known. And it's a real favourite of mine to return to in the springtime. And then this is a Dean Street Press edition. I wanted to share another Dean Street Press book that I love to pick up in the springtime. That's Spring Magic by D.E. Stevenson. I've been reading quite a bit of D.E. Stevenson lately. She's just an author I naturally seem to gravitate to in the spring. I do like a bit of gentle romance at this time of year. That just seems to fit the season very well. And D.E. Stevenson is really the queen of gentle, cozy romance. And she's also a very good writer, so I really recommend her books. This one is set during World War II. It's about a young woman who moves to a little village in Scotland and does find a rather surprising romance. But I also love the detail about army wives during the war and other sort of period detail that comes into this book that just adds another layer of interest for me. But it's a lovely springtime read, and I love the Scottish setting as well. And then a book that I really want to return to this year, because it's been a long time since I read it, but it starts in May, so this is one that I'm hoping to get to a bit later this season, is Watership Down by Richard Adams. And I have this edition illustrated by John Lawrence. And this is a book that's told all from the perspective of rabbits and a sort of warren of rabbits. And that, of course, makes it very appropriate, I feel, for the springtime, that season of rabbits. And it does start, like I said, in May as well. So this is a book that I really want to return to. It's such a classic of nature writing as well. And it's such an imaginative story too. So I'm really looking forward to reading this one again. I wanted to share a few non-fiction choices with you as well. This is a new book by John Lewis Stemple that's part of a series of these slim little volumes that he's done about different animals. And this one is The Curious Life of the Cuckoo. And of course, the sound of the cuckoo really used to herald summer coming. And it was a sound that you would hear so much more sadly than you do nowadays in the countryside in the springtime. I have heard the cuckoo once or twice as we've lived in Yorkshire, and it was really special to hear it, but it is sad how little you hear this bird nowadays. But I really am curious to learn more about the bird, so I'm looking forward to reading this. I always love John Lewis Stemple's writing. He's such a talented writer on the natural world, so this is one that I'm really looking forward to. And then, of course, spring is the season of birdsong returning. I'm starting to be wakened a little bit by the dawn chorus of the birds, and I know that's just going to get louder and louder as we go into spring, and it's something I really look forward to. It's just such a big part of the soundscape of the countryside, although sadly, as I just said about the cuckoo too, this soundscape is lessening. So this is a book that talks about birdsong, about the importance of birdsong in British culture in particular. It looks at in poetry, for instance, and literature. It's about what we can still enjoy. It's about how birdsong is diminishing more. And it's A Sweet Wild Note by Richard Smith. So again, just a very appropriate book, I feel, to pick up in the springtime to learn more about the birds that you're hearing, but also the cultural significance of birdsong too. So a really interesting read, and I think a great non-fiction choice for the springtime. And then finally, this is a book I'd like to read as a non-fiction choice in the spring, because to me, our senses really become awakened all over again in the springtime. And this is Life in Five Senses by Gretchen Rubin. How exploring the senses got me out of my head and into the world. And I think this is just, again, quite an appropriate choice to pick up in the spring when my senses become more alive. And I think it just sounds really interesting. I love Gretchen Rubin's writing. I really like her books, The Happiness Project, and her work on habits as well as happiness. I enjoy her podcast. So I really am interested in this more recent publication of hers. And then moving on to a bedside table recommendation. I do love to have a nature poem for every spring evening, edited by Jane McMullen Hunter, on my bedside table in the springtime. I do love to try to read a poem a day, and this is just a really wonderful anthology for the season of spring. And then to conclude this video, I just wanted to share two children's book recommendations for the spring. One is The Wind in the Willows, a real classic by Kenneth Grahame. Again, another book I've read with my Comfort Book Club. And this starts in the springtime, very famously, when the mole decides to give up spring cleaning and instead go out and seek adventures in the springtime. It's one of my very favourite openings to a book. And this is just such a charming story. So again, this is just one I love to return to in the spring. Even if I do that by listening to the audiobook version, it's just such a pleasure to do that each spring. So I love this one. And then I also wanted to recommend this book, The Wind Boy by Ethel Cook Eliot. You may remember that I think a couple of years ago, maybe now, a year or two anyway, my mum found this book for me. I'd remembered part of the story, and I knew I'd loved this story as a child, but I couldn't remember the title, I couldn't remember the author, but my mum managed to figure it out, and it was such a joy to get this book back in my life, because I had just loved it when I was a child, and to read it again. And it's actually a lovely spring read. It's set in the springtime. It's about some refugee children who are being ostracized by their local community. Their mum has to go out and work each day, but then a mysterious young woman comes from the mountains to help take care of the children, and she brings some real magic and enchantment into their lives and transforms their lives. And there's some really beautiful descriptions of the natural world in here as well. And it's just a really charming and lovely spring read. So anyway, those are my recommendations for your spring reading this year. Do let me know what you're planning to read in the spring, if you've got any seasonal book choices lined up, or if you're inspired to read any of these, I'd love to know. But thank you so much for watching my video. Extra big thanks as always to those of you who pressed the super thanks button on my last video. You know how much I appreciate your support. I'll see you again next week, though the video won't be going up on Thursday next week. It'll be going up on Sunday next week, just to fit with my life at the moment. I'll see you again then, and have a wonderful weekend ahead. Goodbye.